Thank you very much for those kind words, and I'd also like to start by thanking Marjorie Murray and the Centre for Intercultural and Indigenous Research and the Anthropology Department of the Catholic University for this very kind invitation to allow me to speak to you today about our current research. So, for more than a century, humanity has been fascinated by the development of the robot and its potential to realise our imagination of the anthropomorphic machine. This is an exercise in alterity, because basically what you have is an object that seems to become more and more like us while remaining other. We therefore start to get concerned with things like, will they turn against us? Or should robots have rights like human beings? But I think that by our fascination with robots, we may have neglected a more profound trajectory towards the anthropomorphic machine. One that proceeds actually through greater intimacy rather than through alterity. And this trajectory, I think, has become clearer through the emergence of the smartphone. In a way, robotics is going to be more superficial, because it's based on appearance. Does something look more like us? However, that creates an ambivalence around what's going on. But by contrast, a smartphone does not look one iota like a human being. It doesn't have arms, it doesn't have legs. It doesn't need limbs because it gets carried in handbags and in pockets. The anthropomorphism proceeds through different processes, like prosthetics and complementarity. It also, because it may have a greater capacity to make us more like or in alignment with it, rather than just the other way around. I can't think there has ever been an invention, a human invention, that is as intimate and as integral to human beings as the smartphone. So clearly, we really do need to understand what this thing is. And actually, what this lecture will argue, above all, is that there is one group of people who are best placed to answer a very straightforward question. What is the smartphone? And that group of people are anthropologists. Now, in pursuance of this goal, we have, since February, had a team of 10 anthropologists, all who started with a 16-month program of ethnography simultaneously in different parts of the world. So Alfonso, I think, has already been introduced to you, and he's working here in Santiago. Maria is working in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Patrick is working in Cameroon, Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon, on both kind of low income and also middle class. Shireen, like Alfonso, are working essentially on migrants, in her case in Milan, Italy. We have a project in a very low-income area in Kampala, in Uganda, from Charlotte. Maya is working with Palestinians in East Jerusalem. We have a project with Xinyu in Shanghai, and the final project with Laura is in Kyoto. And that is actually a methodology that we established in the previous project, where we spent 5 years studying social media, where because everyone works at the same time, every month we can compare and collaborate and take further decisions as to where the project will go. Now, there are all sorts of claims made in the newspapers about what smartphones are doing to us. But what I'm saying is, before you can work out what the implications of smartphones are, you need to establish this question of what it is. When you first buy a smartphone, it is just a machine. All Galaxy Notes that you see in the shop are the very much same thing. But my argument would be, at that point, it has just the potential, the capacity to be smart. What actually realises that possibility of smart comes from what I will be calling smart from below. It actually comes from the way people transform that machine once they have purchased it. Firstly, through things like the deletion and addition of apps, and then through a whole series of other processes. So it follows that if we want to discover what a smartphone is, you need to actually engage with what it has become following those transformative processes that only begin after the phone is purchased. So what we do is we use our ethnography to gain the trust of people so that we know them reasonably well, and then we ask them to open up their phone. At which point we go through every single app on the phone. We try and work out what they do with it, we get stories about them, we work out what are the networks involved in this, until we have, in a sense, a complete picture of what is contained in that particular phone in respect to its usage. Now, you can't just list the apps, because often there are apps that haven't been deleted or used once and never used again. People make some use of the pre-installed apps or functions. They may use the torch or the alarm, some other element that was already in the phone, but I never met a phone that consisted only of its pre-installed apps. Once they get it, they start adding all sorts of things to it. Some of the older people say, oh, I just use my phone for voice calls and for text. But actually, when you open their phone, you get this, all sorts of apps jostling for position. So, speaking from my own field work in Ireland, I realised there was one more field site where there are two of us working, Pauline and myself in Ireland. I would say the most common functions that we find are things like WhatsApp, maps, voice calls, camera, alarm time, Facebook, text messages, weather and news. But once you add a variety of more specialist apps, sports, music, airlines, banks, you end up with, I would say, typically the people I'm involved in who are sort of mid-age to later life, they're usually in their sort of 60s to 70s, are using around 25 to 30 functions of that phone. Now, personalisation of the phone starts with this decision as to what initial apps to discard and what to add to create that person's particular configuration. It then proceeds through other steps. So you may have the app, but you may change the setting. So if you're going to do sports, you might change the size, your weight and your height, for example. Or you might set the news to particular things that you're interested in. But the important thing about phones that in a sense make them particularly different through other kind of devices is that they have the capacity to learn from you. So that the involvement of things like algorithms, artificial intelligence are developed in the phone precisely for that reason, so that the phone actually learns from usage. So the more you use those particular apps, at a very basic level, things like the conversations you have, the more the phone understands who you are. So if we think of it as a series of layers, you've got the kind of carapace, the material culture of the phone that you mentioned. Then you have the apps that you see kind of in the foreground, the ones that you tend to use. Let's say somebody concentrates, they go by train to commute in the morning, they might have their games, their social media and their news. Then in something like the Samsung Galaxy, you have the background apps. So in my case, the obscure ones you only use occasionally. In my case, for example, I've got one app that allows me to recognise bird song if I'm walking in the daytime, and another one that shows me the constellations of stars if I'm walking at night. It's not something I use a lot, but it's there. So you then have another layer, because you also, of course, differentiate these apps by genres of usage. So you can see here there's the Kindle, which allows you to read, but are you reading romance, or crime, or encyclopedias, or something else? So there's a whole series of different layers that basically create these apps. Now, what we're trying to understand then is this close relationship between persons and the machine in this anthropomorphic sense. And one of the things we decided is that the problem with studying with smartphones is they've been very associated with youth. So in a way, abstracting them out of that gives you a better sense to see them in themselves, without necessarily making a whole lot of assumptions that come from that initial association. So our work tends to be with sort of people middle-aged and a bit above, and I'm actually not going to concentrate on aging in this lecture because there's a lot I want to say about smartphones and health. But the thing that really emerges from all these translations is how a phone takes on the persona. So who are these phones? Can you put it that way? Well, in Ireland, I meet somebody who was a fisherman. And this fisherman is very pragmatic, very rugged. And he's very concerned that things should be justified by function. So he says, we only use that. He used to use Skype when his daughter was in Australia, but now she's left Australia, it's like, you mustn't use Skype, that's superfluous. By contrast, I was working with a woman in mid-60s, and she was a professional. And when you open up her iPhone, you find that she has constructed, everything is nested under very fixed categories. This is sport, this is news, and so forth. But then, if she has a task, such as she has to pay a gas bill, electricity bill, what she does is she has that in her calendar, then that is linked to some notes, the notes link to websites, and then a whole series of procedures. And when you unpack this, you realise that actually this phone is several hundred pages of life manual that she has created out of the phone. There are phones that relate to particular interests and activities. There's the retired person who plays ukulele, and he's using his phone for things like tuning and for organising the ukulele group. There's the person who's added 7 main apps to their phone, but they're all about sailing. One of the things that's fairly common in this situation is the people I'm dealing with are aging, but they're not necessarily elderly. So somebody who is, let's say, 70 may have a parent who's 90. And sadly, when you reach that age, you're increasingly likely to be involved in things like dementia and Alzheimer's. So then, when you look at that person's phone, you find a phone that is basically only understandable in that context. It's a phone which is about WhatsApp to organise the collaboration of all the people that help care for the parent. It's where Facebook is used to get the pictures of the children or grandchildren, great-grandchildren that you're showing to this person. It has the maps that make sure you get to the right medical appointment. It has the text and voice that allow you to negotiate with the local medical insurance or local government. And it's a phone that is always on, because when you're dealing with somebody that elderly, you just never know what's going to happen. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that actually it is the processes of transformation that create the smart phone. Now, personalization is not the same as individualization. Because actually, when you study a particular person's phone, you find that if you only talk to the wife, and you don't also talk to the husband, you're ignoring the domestic division of labour. She may not have banking apps because he has got banking apps. She may not have, one of them may not have Facebook, but they're looking at the pictures of the children on the other person's Facebook. So there is a complementarity between these things. But what I think is hopefully clear is we are not talking about the replacement of, as it were, real people by kind of fake machines. The rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of these algorithms, mean that the personality that the phone is manifesting isn't some random other person. It is that person, particularly that person. And it's learning more and more about them all the time. So it's a kind of self-avatar. If anyone happens to know the children's books by Philip Pullman, I tend to think of the phone as a demon, a sort of outside expression of that person. And that process is only going to grow. Because just as we are developing the phone in our personality, the corporations who create these phones are trying to develop the kind of the phone's human-like avatar. So these are things that they will give names to. So you may have met Bixby and Siri and OK Google and their cousin Alexa. It's not actually a phone, but it's obviously connected. At present, most people will use these mainly to do things like answer informational questions or listen to radio or something. But we know that the future developments, things like the artificial intelligence-driven chatbot, will develop these capacities further, and we expect that then there will be the evolution of this sense that this avatar is also perhaps a friend, or something that's important in dealing perhaps with loneliness and isolation amongst older people, which is the sort of thing that's being experimented upon in Japan. So these processes are growing ever more intimate and, in a sense, ever more profound. The smartphone indeed shows how, in a sense, crude and, if you like, relatively insensitive a lot of the earlier media used to be. Because, the way the phone shows that, we used to just regularly to make phone calls, but actually now we recognise that we would text first to check whether it's a good time to make a phone call, because that, in a sense, is more sensitive. And one of the pieces of work that I did in relation to this issue was, as part of the last project, I looked at the use of phones by people with terminal illness, usually cancer, on behalf of the hospice. The hospice was asking me to advise them on the use of new media. And you start to realise that actually people have particular relationships to these different media. So, for example, the doctors tended to assume that face-to-face is always a better way of communicating. But I was finding that the patients in this situation, sometimes they are dealing with incredibly difficult information. It may be about the aspects of being a terminal patient. And sometimes they would say, actually, no, face-to-face is too immediate, I don't know what to say. In the quiet, in my room, when I can slowly compose my response, is actually, for me, the appropriate way to deal with that information. And exploring these kinds of issues was actually the topic of the last book that I wrote. It's called The Comfort of People, which is about the social relations of hospice patients and terminal patients. Okay, so you have the phone and its personalisation, and as I've already said, it's a mistake to see it as simply an individualistic project. Actually, as anthropologists would automatically assume, it relates to wider parameters. It relates, as I mentioned, to the couple, the family, but also to issues of cultural difference. An example of that would be that, obviously, if people are studying, say, migrants, then it's likely that we have to understand the smartphone as the hub of a whole network, which may involve diasporic populations or certainly transnational populations of different kinds. In our site in Uganda, it's very important for linking people who've moved into the town back with the seniors who live back in the villages. But perhaps, at least a more detailed example of that would be if you travel the distance between China and Japan. Because what strikes you is just how different usage of the phones between these two domains. In visiting China recently, I don't remember a single time when Xinyuan paid for anything either with cash or with plastic, with debit or credit cards. Every purchase was made using the phone. And indeed, when I tried to pay with plastic or cash, people looked at me as though, firstly, I was very old-fashioned, and also it would be a bother. Whereas you go to Japan, and they don't like plastic for the opposite reason. An awful lot, I mean, my rent was paid in cash, and cash was definitely preferred. So things have a very different relationship in terms of usage. But this is something that we actually need to explain in terms of the society and history of these two areas. So in the case of China, why are they so quickly developing this new capacity? Well, these older people that we're dealing with, a lot of them went through the Cultural Revolution, and they're still very much influenced by the ideology of the Communist Party, which in those days they definitely would have associated with. And one of the points was precisely the repudiation of the past and the mission to become modern, to be the modern me. And as a result of that, even the older people, maybe especially the older people, because they went through the Cultural Revolution, tend to believe that these phones are actually designed in many ways with them in mind. That this is their instrument for becoming modern in that way. So quite differently from Japan, or indeed from where I work, you can go into a restaurant or look around and you will see there all the young people are talking face to face, and it's the seniors who are engrossed in their smartphones. And of course, one of the implications of that is when you find older people elsewhere who seem to have great difficulty in using smartphones, it may suggest a lot of that has to do with attitude rather than necessarily ability. Japan, very different. Different because in Japan there is such a significance to the continuation of traditions, to remaining close to certain historical links, etc. And being cautious about the destructive impact of a lot of these modern forces. In addition to which, you also have a different underlying cosmology. So Japan is a place where anthropomorphic objects have a much longer and, if you like, deeper history. This is a place where you might have funerals for inanimate objects as well as for people. One of the ways this really showed itself in our work was that in Ireland, I'm saying, if I'm doing these interviews, it's best to start with the smartphone. It seems very neutral. And only when you know somebody pretty well do you start discussing things like aging and death. Whereas the person in Japan is saying, no, actually I find it's easier to talk to people about things like aging and death, and you need to know them really well before they're prepared to discuss something as intimate as the smartphone. So this is really all an expression of one of the core anthropological contributions, which is basically cultural relativism and difference. And this was the major theme of our previous project in Wiley Post and continues into this project. Just to give you like one example from the previous project about how the construction of the content of these things varies from place to place. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it means online to become a mother. The English, which is where I worked in the previous project, what do they post on Facebook when they become a mother? They post like this. You start off, the mother is still there, but pretty soon she is completely displaced because these are the profile pictures of the Facebook, right? This is not the Facebook of the infant, it's the Facebook of the mother. And quite quickly, the mother has disappeared from her own profile to be replaced by her infant. So that's the English style of response to becoming a mother. What happens in Trinidad? when you become a mother. You post these. And what these say is, do not think for 1 minute that just because I have become a mother, I am any less glamorous or sexy or out there than I was before. Okay. And similarly, our job is, with the smartphone, to also continue to encounter these differences and these unexpected results. I mean, just to give one example from the current project, Charlotte Hawkins, who's working in Uganda, went into the study with the assumption that, from other reading, that what was happening with the smartphone was that these young people were getting involved in town life in Kampala, and therefore there was a neglect of traditional seniors' authority, as these people were kind of abandoned in the villages. What she actually found in this project was exactly the opposite. What the smartphone has done is has allowed the young people who migrated to work into towns to actually now send money back, because mobile money is a big thing in East Africa, to send money back and show their respect and show their support for the elders in the village. So the point about our collaborative and comparative project is precisely to be open to these continued differences. The other, I think, problem in the way people tend to explain and talk about these developments in social media and the smartphone is that you'll find that increasingly people want to utilize these as a relatively simplistic cause. So, children bully each other because of social media, or we're losing our attention span because of the smartphone. Now, I think the tradition of anthropology has always been to say we need to see these things contextualized in a much deeper sense of society and of history. So let me give one example of this. One of the most common ways in which people use this kind of argument is to say that, nowadays young people are confused. They don't really understand what is the meaning of a friend, right? What is friendship? And the problem is, you had these social medias, they had a title like Friendster, or you have Facebook that uses as a verb to friend somebody. And this was kind of well captured in an episode in South Park, because here's Stan, and his dad comes in and says, Stan, you haven't friended Grandma. And Stan is going there saying, what? Grandma's not well, why haven't you friended your Grandma? Friending your grandma? What's that about? Well, actually, it's quite an interesting question. Because if you look at this in a rather deeper way, there have been profound transformations in this relationship between kinship and friendship. When I was a child, loads of people would be introduced to me as, come and meet Auntie so-and-so, come and meet Uncle so-and-so. And of course, most of these people were not actually uncles or aunties. They exhibited what anthropologists call fictive kinship, where kinship is the dominant idiom, so you show respect to a friend by subsuming them under the label of kinship, auntie and uncle. Now, the years go on, and what happens today? Today, you're on the street and somebody comes up and they say, I'd like you to meet my mother, but also my best friend. Or I'd like you to meet my sister, also one of my closest friends. In other words, today we seem to be subsuming kinship under the nomenclature of friendship. The reason I would think is pretty clear. We are of a generation that essentially sees the authenticity of relationships much more in terms of the ability to choose rather than the idea that you are simply stuck with something by virtue of custom, and kinship is fixed and friendship is choosable. But the point is that all this happened before the development of social media. So social media is actually being simplified as cause, when really quite often these changes are, as it were, surfing a wave. They are helping to make manifest deeper changes that are going on in history and society. And one of the tasks here of anthropology is precisely to bring that kind of deeper context to their understanding. Mostly, the concerns that we hear about these days with regard to smartphones are concerns about things like regulation, corporations knowing too much about it, and so forth. But even that is complex when you actually look at it in the detail of a particular instance. So somebody I know, they were travelling in southern Italy, and his wife broke her leg. So he starts by having to use things like Google Maps to find the hospital. Then nobody speaks a word of English, so he's using Translate in order to communicate with people. Then they've got to find somewhere to stay. So that's TripAdvisor, Airbnb. He needs them to communicate what's going on. That might be Skype or WhatsApp. Stuck there for several days, wants to keep up with the news items, and also he has to deal with like insurance and a whole series. So she knows all the streets. And then along comes Google Maps, and nobody cares about the fact that she knows this. Or somebody had developed what you probably wouldn't consider very good Spanish, a bit of Spanish, because it's very common where I work for people to go on the Camino on northern Spain. So at least they have a bit of Spanish for that. But then along comes Google Translate, and again, there's no status, in a sense, in the knowledge that they have gained. So there are many ways in which actually we can see these phones as quite cool and quite inhuman, but then so are people. So I don't see it as less anthropomorphic. Actually, one of the ways these people could get revenge on the phone, they have an ally for this, which is actually the newspapers. If you read newspapers about smartphones and social media, pretty much every day you will read some story about the destructive or negative impact of these new instruments, okay? And actually, if you think about it, there is a reason for that. Newspapers have found their business support, their foundations, destroyed by these new instruments. They don't know how they're going to survive in this new environment where the advertising has all gone elsewhere. So I figure it's not actually that surprising that you don't read much by way of positive stories about these media on the newspapers. People don't seem to appreciate that these are in many ways competitive instruments. And that has problems again with the people that we work with, because they are the ones who are influenced by newspapers, and therefore, when the newspaper says you mustn't press the button that gives permission to this app to do all these things, they don't press it. Young people just press it without even thinking about it. But as a result, it's the people we're dealing with who often cannot use the capacities of the phone for that reason. But I don't want to represent people of this age as in some ways sort of inactive or passive in relation to this, because actually conservatism itself turns out to be a very active pursuit. I see what these people are doing as a kind of crafting activity to try and make the phone often comfortable to themselves. I'll just give you one extreme example of this, which was an IT engineer, retired IT engineer who I worked with, and he liked his old Nokia phone because his Nokia phone had great battery life. Oops. That was actually another of the classes for teaching smartphones that one of our team really uses in Brazil. Here's another one. Had a great battery life, it was very simple. He resents the fact that he's had to go to these kind of smartphones with all these gimmicks. But he's got the IT skills. So he's actually taken his Galaxy, he's stripped it of most of what it does, so it now lasts an unbelievable 120 hours without a charge. And he's also organised it so that the phone just goes straight through to the landline when he's at home, so you can forget about it. So conservatism can actually be quite creative in trying to make these things kind of comfortable. Okay, so to sum all this up, basically what I'm arguing is that we need a concept, which I'm taking from the anthropologist called Catherine Peak, who worked with mobile phones in Kinshasa in Congo, and she's the one who came up with the idea of smart from below. And I think we need this phrase because, in a sense, almost like humanity would recover something of its self-esteem in the face of all these kind of intimidating new technologies, corporate powers, etc. If we recognise the degree to which it is our craft that make these phones not just clever smart, but also sensibly smart. The phone's potential for anthropomorphism may be created by corporations, but any subsequent humanity, or indeed inhumanity, tends to be our gift. Right, so in this project, one of the differences from our previous project is that we didn't want just to observe and study the phone. We also felt that that gave us a responsibility. After all, we're dealing with older people who, amongst other things, tend to experience greater ill health. They're losing capacities as well as gaining capacities. And we were concerned with how we can actually help shift these phones in the direction of genuinely being beneficial to people's welfare. And what was our philosophy was, again, not to go with an agenda, not to have the thing that we knew we were going to do, but as anthropologists, to spend at least the first 9 months just listening, just doing ethnography, before we decided which way to go. Nevertheless, there was something that was very transformative, actually quite early on. And that was that when I came up with the title of Smartphones, Smart Aging and M-Health, I thought that the term M-Health must mean mobile health apps. And that was because there is this vast industry developing around creating specialist smartphone apps for health. One figure I saw suggested that something like 300,000 health apps are being created all the way around the world. No idea if it's true. But certainly it's interesting that something like, the new Apple Watch is advertising itself because it has some kind of variable heart monitor. Right? So this is something that vast amounts of money are going into, vast amounts of expertise are going into, but clearly it represents smart from above. It's the medics, it's the technical people creating these things and then hoping to find a way to get people to use them. We felt, after actually a relatively short period of our work, that our prediction would be that the vast majority of these are simply not going to be used. That indeed, it's not just those, but phones are not things that we think are just going to proliferate endless numbers of new apps, specialist apps. That actually people prefer to concentrate on the 25, 30, or whatever it is, apps that essentially have become part of everyday usage. The only health app that is used by the population I'm working with is step counters, 10,000 steps a day. And as one shy woman once said to me, she thinks she does it because she wants to impress her back. So, if you go to younger people, sure, there are people who use period tracking, pregnancy, some other, but again, it's not much compared to what is being developed at the moment in this industry. So actually, then we started to realise, maybe M-Health doesn't need to mean specialist health apps. It just means using your mobile phone in relation to health. And the phone is hugely But it's not the specialist apps. It's actually the use of things like WhatsApp or Google that really, really matter in terms of people's relationship to health. So what we then try to do is to start developing projects which focus on what we feel is far more significant in understanding this relationship. So it's not surprising that both Alfonso here and Marilia, working in Sao Paulo, are concentrating on WhatsApp development. And the point is basically to, so these are the more specialist apps, and I'll come to that in a minute. The point is that if you go out and do ethnography, you come across all sorts of groups who are doing all sorts of really quite interesting things with WhatsApp. And what we want to do is put these together and actually create a kind of, almost like a library of the capacities of WhatsApp. And indeed, when I did my hospice work originally, when WhatsApp was first beginning, one of the recommendations I made was about the formation of WhatsApp support groups amongst the relatives of the patient. And that was the one that the director of Hospice UK took from my work, and then when she got a new patient, she said to people, would you like to create a WhatsApp group to organise support? Now I find pretty much everyone does it anyway, but there are all sorts of other uses there. So looking at things like WhatsApp being used in terms of emergencies when people fall, WhatsApp for looking at examination reports or visual media which allow people to actually have a record of whatever is going on with that particular person. In the case of Alfonso's work, we just went this afternoon to look at a very important but neglected group of figures in the health services, which are managerial nurses, a bit like the kind of midfield players in football. You don't notice them because we're concentrating on who scores and who saves the goals, but actually they're the ones who actually do a lot of, and what's important, as Alfonso shows, particularly important because if you're ill in Santiago, as elsewhere, you're facing medical issues, but you're also probably facing a lot of bureaucracy. And that's when really often you need advice and support from these people, because they come in with humanity precisely when you're facing something that we all experience as a kind of inhumanity. It doesn't necessarily follow, however, that all the ways in which we see these more ubiquitous uses of the smartphone involved in health are necessarily positive. I have been looking, amongst other things, at the impact of Googling for health. And if there's one thing that we pretty much all do, it is Googling for health. And I hadn't really anticipated what I found. I just thought, there's information, there's Google, and I thought it was something neutral. And actually what came up from my work was the way that Google's main impact is in many ways to exacerbate differences in class. And the reason for that is that you find some of the users been to university, got a bit of experience in doing research. So they actually know how to work with that information. And indeed, some of them will go all the way out to the medical journals and get the foundational information that is at the heart of medical knowledge. By contrast, you have the other section of the population who do not have that advantage. And when they go to Google, what do they see? At the top of Google, they tend to see things which are basically the things that cause maximum anxiety, that are about that scare people, that tell you whatever you've got is going to produce the word must be cancer or something like that. Lots and lots of misinformation. And the result of Google for them is they get more misinformed and more anxious. So Google is not a thing. It actually, in its usage, it actually exacerbates these differences in class. So our job is to take this information and try and come up with projects that are relevant to the specific areas we work with. As Alfonso has found a specific niche, as it were, here. So, for example, Charlotte Hawkins, working in Uganda, is looking at how people view mental health issues, with the idea of developing a phone service because the actual services are very distant from those people. Or Patrick Rondo is working in Cameroon, is dealing with the problem that people from the diaspora want to give money to support health conditions, but often the money isn't actually being used in the way that they thought actually for health. So can we transfer money directly, say, to the clinics, etc. So in my case, I'm looking at two things in Ireland, in my case is me and Pauline, something called social prescribing, which is basically, instead of prescribing medicines, it's the idea that when people, either from depression or when they're tired and becoming lonely and isolated, can you, instead of prescribing medicines, you prescribe activities, things that bring them into a more active world and also into a more socialised world. But to do that, you need to have a comprehensive guide of all the activities that actually exist in that particular region, and that's something we're doing. In the longer term, I think the larger project that we want to develop, and it'll probably be the whole team participating in this, is actually a project on menopause. And menopause is a topic that goes with the issue of aging, which we are otherwise studying, but also it lends itself to this kind of anthropological sensibility. Because if you just treat menopause as something to do with biomedicine, you're missing all sorts of wider consequences, the way it relates to family life, to the sense of oneself, aging, etc., and beyond that. So, for example, I might go one day and talk to a woman, she's a feminist, and she says, you know, what I don't like is the fact that menopause is seen as this kind of medical problem, when actually we need to celebrate it. This is a natural evolution for women's bodies, and why do we have to see it in that kind of way? But the next day, I'm talking to a woman who is taking IVF because she's desperate to have a baby, and there is no way she's going to want to celebrate menopause. So, what I think anthropology potentially could do, and what we would like to do in our project, is to develop smartphone-based information that is actually trying to incorporate the very complex and contradictory sensitivities that you only uncover if it comes out of the development of our fieldwork. So in all these different examples, what we're trying to do is face the original kind of aim of the project, which is basically to use ethnography and in a very open fashion to find what are the gaps. I mean, I didn't know, so before I got there, how people in Ireland have difficulty still today in discussing something like menopause. But it arises in fieldwork, and then that becomes the thing that you need to concentrate on if you're going to use this fieldwork to actually then develop an effective and appropriate intervention. Okay, so I think that the last thing I would say is that when I'm talking about the applied, the practical, the consequences, one thing we found from our last project is this also needs to include research dissemination. Because when you're dealing with something like social media, smartphone, everybody wants to know about this. To do something narrowly that only goes to other anthropologists would be, to my mind, tragic. So what we did in the last project is we really tried to open up. We produced, the Why We Post project, which you can look up, produced 11 books. But those 11 books are all open access, they're all free. Furthermore, we wrote them in standard English, that somebody in school could understand, and we tried to keep the academic discussion in footnotes. And now the point was that worked. And what I mean by that is, I think as a consequence, you know how many books we normally sell of an ethnographic monograph in anthropology, right? Our books have passed 500,000 downloads. 500,000. And better still, if you look at the figures, because you can, at where these downloads are coming from, we see really impressive figures in in places like Ethiopia, the Philippines, places where I suspect very few traditional anthropological books would be selling. So for us, that educational aim is just as important as intervention, so practical intervention, as these other ones we're talking about. And again, of course, it's using digital media, the capacity of digital media, in the dissemination as it is in the practical version. So, to conclude, I argued at the beginning that this was a lecture, above all, about the necessity of anthropology. And the first example I gave was that if to know what the phone is, means being involved in the phone when it is in the form that it is transformed by people, there is no other way of answering that fundamental question, what is a smartphone? Unless you actually engage in this kind of qualitative research where you have the context and you have the trust and you can get to that level of depth. So I think we are the only people to answer the question of what is a smartphone. But beyond that, I tried to give a lecture where I believe the strength of anthropology is that we start with something which is quite philosophical, like the nature of anthropomorphism and its difference in robotics. But we go all the way through to end up with something that is quite practical and consequential. And I believe that one of the definitions of anthropology ought to be that it is the discipline that doesn't just go into one area or the other, but takes on the responsibility for actually keeping these things always linked together.
Si quieren hacer preguntas, por aquí está el micrófono.
Thank you very much for the talk, and I guess I just particularly thinking about the relationship between our phones and us. Last night, Siri started speaking to me in Italian, and I've had my phone for 5 years, and the sense of a strange, just this very visceral sense of my phone not knowing me and the malfunctions, just sort of resonated with what you presented in many ways. I had a question about, I appreciate the point about relation to social inequality, class, and the discussion of Google searches and so on. I was wondering how you, or if you could speak a bit more about how you're thinking about those issues in relation to people who have different types of smartphones, or whether it's an iPhone, whether it's a different type of phone or settings, ethnographic settings in which you have people working with smartphones and not so smartphones. Moreover, I think particularly in contexts, so in Latin America you have people who will have a phone contract that they'll pay every month and so on, and sort of a prepaid system versus people whose access to data might be more limited, more irregular, and sort of how the project is thinking about those sorts of differences.
I mean, the first point is that the answer will be highly differentiated in terms of the context of a particular film situation. So, Japan, actually, an awful lot of people use a thing called Goike, a feature phone that is neither a smartphone nor what we think of as an unsmartphone. It's an in-between phone, and so the whole situation of what the phone is in Japan is different. China, they use them probably use a different set of phones again. And of course, if you deal with like a shanty town in Kampala, Uganda, there are plenty of people who simply can't, if they can afford some kind of Chinese phone, they have problems affording things like data and ability to use it. Nevertheless, what I think is surely striking today, and would be true of all our sites, is that partly because if you include these cheap Chinese phones, these $30, $40 phones are amazing. We think we need Samsung Galaxy, we need iPhones. Actually, in most respects, these cheap Chinese phones do pretty much the same as Windows things. And these are phones that are therefore developing at an incredibly low level in places in Africa and India that we wouldn't believe. And also, because these are sites where social relations operate in a different way, commonly, if you can't, your child or somebody in the family does. And so it's better to leave the phone as a shared capacity. But it means you have the capacity. So we are faced with deep inequalities. Some of our sites are second middle class sites, and some of our sites are sites of real poverty. And that's one of the ways, in a sense, we answer the question, by having global comparisons that are based around quite major differences in terms of that capacity. But I think that, something that came up from our previous project is, in a way, I think the more profound trajectory is the opposite. That actually it used to be that the key thing was what you could afford, which is why Filipinos say basically texted, because that was free, they didn't do other things. But with the development of these phones, and yes, it has a way to go, but we've got to think about the trajectory. It's clear that these population, people we never thought would have them, already have them, and that seems to be growing apace. So, and when you have an internet plan or a phone plan, it no longer makes any difference whether you're using voice, text, or this other thing. And the last project we came up with this concept of polymedia. And I think polymedia is important for anthropology because what we argue is the real significance of this is that it re-socializes and re-modernizes media. In other words, that if there isn't a financial reason for why you did it this way, why you did it that way, then I'm going to judge you. Why did you dump your boyfriend by WhatsApp when you could at least voice call or maybe even face to face? So I think that as we move out from your question, in a sense, we're entering into very interesting new questions that are unprecedented, which actually transform our fundamental relationship to media itself. So it's not, I think we will be dealing with those issues, and they're built into the project itself in comparative terms. But I don't want to neglect the other end.
Hi, I'm asking you. Thank you very much for this lecture. I've got two questions. My first question is about privacy. So you talked a lot about intimacy, but I was wondering if in this extensive field work there were any maybe insights about how people talk about what they want other people to know about them, either people or companies, the data they produce or the data they consume. That's the first question.
And let's take that. Okay, this was something that came out quite profoundly actually in the previous project. Because when you're working in something, I was working in England at that time, people are obsessed with, they think this is the death of privacy. Not only do the corporations know everything about them, but their mother knows everything about them, right? So, and this is seen as a crisis. They are continually talking about and concerned with the loss of privacy. However, we are also working in places there like China and India. So, for example, Xinyiwen's book was with, she wrote a book about factory workers in China. And these factory workers come from rural areas, and it's not a small group, we're talking about 250 million people. That's the biggest migration in human history. And where they came from, in extended families, nobody knocked on doors, they basically didn't, for them, privacy is this new modern thing that they're aspiring to. And the use of social media or indeed the phone, it's almost the first time they've really had the opportunity. So half the world is talking about the death of privacy, the other half is talking about the birth of privacy. So quite apart from, in a sense, trying to assess what this actually means in those terms, it has really interesting consequences. And again, in each place, Tom MacDonald, who was working on that project, just had a paper published in the American Anthropologist, I think, last week or something. And one of the things he's pointing out, and he has the other side in China, was that actually there hadn't in China really been any kind of relationship to the stranger. It had been frowned upon and it just wasn't there. The possibility, however, of using the new technology to contact strangers, often on conditions of anonymity, meant that you could say all sorts of things that you would be very frightened to say to anybody that you knew. So these are the kind of, yes, we can talk about the threat of privacy as the newspapers do all the time, but I think what we are trying to do is look at it from the perspective of these different populations, and there we see a very different story, a more diverse story. What was your other question?
Well, thank you. The other question, it's about the relationship you established between the object and people and artificial intelligence. So how do these machines learn from us and we also learn from them? So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what also I've been reading a lot in newspaper about creating unbiased technology or trying to create algorithms that are not biased.
I think it's actually a rather different issue because there are certain areas, politics or whatever, recruitment, in which I understand why people are concerned with that issue. But to be honest, we tend to be not issue-focused in our work. We tend to say, we take our issues from the ethnography of the populations. Their concerns are the concerns that we need to concentrate on. And when you think about what I've just been describing in terms of what the phone then becomes, the issue of bias in an algorithm is nothing compared to the issue of bias in a human being. Right? When we talk about bias, listen to people around you. I don't know any unbiased people. So an unbiased algorithm would be a very inhuman kind of concept. Necessary in certain contexts, but far removed from the world of smartphones in their ordinary usage by ordinary people, because they are sure as hell going to be biased.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My first question would be about, I would like to know more about the methodology that you used. Exactly how did you recruit the participants in this ethnography study? And secondly, I would like to know whether you detected any differences in terms of gender, particularly in Chilean context, in the barriers or obstacles that older people find when using smartphones.
Okay, I think because it would be a very long answer to describe our entire methodology, what I would say is that in many ways we are extremely traditional anthropologists. And what I mean by that is that we retain this idea that you cannot study social media or smartphones by studying online. Actually, the vast majority of our work is traditional offline research. Because if you want to know whether the thing they're doing on their phone is to do with gender, or education, or labour markets, or whatever else, or religion, you have to know about all those things. I tend to describe ethnography as what I call holistic contextualization. Because the person lives in all the things that they are, and therefore we don't know in advance which of those things is relevant to our topic. So we try and participate in the life of that community so that we are exposed to as diverse a life as they actually lead. Now, whether you do that more through, say, interviewing, drinking, or any other kind of... Often, for me, method is a form of sensitivity to a population. In other words, if you use the method you intended to use, it just shows you're bad work. Maybe you haven't picked up the sensitivity. Do you remember I was saying before that I start discussing the smartphone and then lead to age and death, the other one the other way around. So the idealistic contextualization and living in the community for 16 months. How precisely you engage with those people, I think, depends on what those people are comfortable with in terms of your relationship with that. And that is something you learn as you go on. So brief methodology is something you should evolve. I don't like consistent methodologies because it means you haven't learned how to be sensitive to that population. But the other part of it is, of course, that we are constantly different, is that traditional anthropology was isolated. You did your work, and then when you came back, you might compare it with somebody else. We, however, compare all the time. So again, to give you an example from the last project, the end of the first couple of months, I think it was Nell Hayes who was working in Arturo-Específico in Chile. It was the other way around. It was the person working in Brazil who said, oh, why do people post on Facebook? And it's obvious, these are very low-income people we're dealing with. They're not going to post the half-built houses they live amongst. They're going to post the swimming pool, by the gym. They will show their aspirations. And then it was the one from Chile who said, what the hell are you talking about? The people here, they know each other. They can't post something that isn't true. Because somebody would expose them and say, I know where you live. You don't go to swimming pools. So everybody posts what actually is natural to that community. So the point was that in both cases, they look at the other person and they say, wait a minute, this isn't as obvious as I thought. I have to explain actively why in this field site they do it this way, because in that field site they don't. So I would say the main contribution that we have made in terms of developing our particular methodology is that you get that continued sensitivity to the particularity and specificity of a site all the way through research. Your second question was about Chile, gender,
Yeah, but I'm working with Peruvian migrants, so in that case, religious Peruvian migrants, there is some division of roles in the project.
I would say that a bit more loudly. One of the main pieces of work that I'm also doing is with Peruvian migrants, and actually quite religious Peruvian migrants. And yes, gender would be hugely important in terms of because of Catholicism and the way in which people are divided in relationship to religion. So there, gender emerges because it is continuity with its relationship to religious practice, and in a way, there are probably similar answers on all the other sides. In other words, gender manifests itself continuously in our fieldwork. But often it is continuity with much deeper gender relationships rather than something, as I was saying about friendship, that you would say is caused by the smartphone, etc. And I gave that example of domestic division of labour in terms of you don't understand the husband unless you understand the wife and vice versa. But one thing I would say is I belong to a tradition of anthropology that does not start with gender studies, ethnic studies, class studies, or any other social parameter. Simply because I believe that you keep an open mind, and whatever turns out to be the important social parameter that expresses itself in your fieldwork, that is what you have to be true to. And in fact, I don't know any society, I've never seen fieldwork where gender doesn't emerge as a hugely important dimension. But we feel that then we are being true to our evidence and our ethnography in precisely saying, talking about the importance of gender.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, for your talk. I have a question because I've been doing some digital field research, I guess, for my thesis work, and something I've noticed is that older people are, I think so, more prone to sharing false information on the internet, and maybe some kind of bias that I have because I've been looking at them more closely lately. But my question is mainly that since there is recognition of some kind of, I don't know, less training, I guess, in the ways of the internet, I think I inhabit some internet that is different to the ones that they do. Have you noticed that maybe they're as motivated as younger people in the spread of information regarding especially these rewards that social networks provide, such as karma or likes or retweets? Do you think that they are as motivated as young people by those?
I can't say that I don't think we particularly observed a phenomenon where older people as such are more likely to spread what you might call false information compared to younger people. But I'm going to make a complete guess, right? I don't know your field work, and I don't know the situation. But I'm going to guess that actually what we have here is not a distinction between older and younger people, but between better educated and less better educated. Because if you think about it, in most of the countries where we are working, education has developed, particularly over the last, say, 20, 30 years, and younger people, by and large, are far better educated, whereas the senior people may actually be illiterate, or certainly much less likely to have a university education, etc. So that to me would make a much more, how should I put it, clear argument in terms of why, when we look at the spreading of information, younger people are better able to research, check, and look at the evidence behind the things they're spreading, whereas older people, in that sense, might not. I can't say this is based on any particular research, but I'm just going to guess that maybe what we're dealing with is actually a correlation. It is not actually one of age, one of education.
Bueno, muchas gracias por su presentación. Quería preguntarle un poco ligado a la pregunta sobre privacidad, que uno tiende a asociar que en el fondo el teléfono es el que te conoce a ti, pero principalmente es mientras el teléfono vaya capturando datos. No sé si ha aparecido dentro del estudio alguna pregunta sobre alguna forma de separación entre los datos del teléfono. Eso por un lado. La segunda pregunta que quería hacerle era cuál es su opinión respecto a la creciente acumulación de poder de un número limitado de conglomerados mediáticos como Facebook, Amazon, los grandes cinco que se le llaman. Sobre todo estoy pensando con la idea que está tomando acción o se está volviendo más de moda el concepto de colonialismo digital, en que un puñado súper reducido de empresas están recopilando estos datos. Me imagino yo que en el fondo el análisis va a ir por el lado de que estos datos o este uso de la plataforma siempre depende de los contextos, pero sobre todo pensando en el mapa que mostró, si es que apareció en el estudio diferencias respecto a críticas en ciertos sectores del sur, el sur global, respecto a la creciente acumulación de datos desde el norte.
I try to be careful to speak to the things that I've actually studied, the things I can claim to know about. And the particular question you've asked, I would say 90% of the work that is going on right now relating to these things like smartphones, social media, etc., is actually about these problems in relation to corporations, data, accumulation, power, etc. So therefore, I would say it is better to go to the people who make those studies. They are the experts, they actually study corporations, they study these issues, and if I'm going to discuss this, I will read the people who have that expertise. I don't think that I should be speculating on things that I do not well understand. By and large, I tend to agree with most of what is being said. That is, there is a real problem here in terms of the corporations, in terms of the power, in terms of the need, particularly the need for greater regulation, etc. So I don't think I would surprise you with anything I would say. By and large, these are issues that come up with the populations we are dealing with, really because they are seeing it as a problem that they are talking about from things like newspapers. So therefore they become sensitive, and let's say people who have political concerns are much more likely to transform the settings on their phones to try and, once they realise that Google follows everywhere they go every day, they think this is maybe not such a good thing, and they will turn off Google's capacity to follow in that way. Most of the populations that we will be dealing with, low income, other areas in the world, they tend to have very immediate concerns with the family, with their own poverty, with issues like that. And I would say, by and large, they just are not very interested in what is going on in corporations and power and the rest of it. And those are the people we study. So we have to try and respect. I mean, what I can tell you is whether or not the people I work with have those concerns. What I can't tell you about is research on how justified those concerns are, because I think that is the expertise of other scholars who work precisely on that, and I don't.